This episode is brought to you by Brilliant, the learning platform designed to be uniquely effective in teaching you to learn by doing, not just watching mindless lecture videos. I know I make them, I watch them all the time. They're not nearly as effective as actually doing these lessons online through Brilliant. And they have thousands of interactive lessons, mostly in math, data analysis, programming, and artificial intelligence. For example, get familiar with Python and start building programs on day one with built-in drag and drop editor. I have no idea how that works. Or learn essential coding elements from loops and variables to nesting and conditionals. See what I mean? I have no idea what any of that means, but I'm going to take the lesson, and in 5 minutes, I'll have an idea of how this works and eventually be able to do it myself. So check it out. Take a break from watching those videos on TikTok and Instagram and Twitter. I know they're big fun, but it's just a mindless waste of time. Go over to brilliant.org/skeptic. Sign up. You get a 20% off your annual subscription and a free 30-day trial. And try one of these lessons. You will get hooked. It's better than TikTok videos, and you get to learn something along the way. So check it out. Brilliant.org/skeptic. See you there. Adam, nice to see you. It's finally great to meet you.
Pleasure to be with you, Michael. I've been a fan of Skeptic, the magazine and the movement, for a very long time, and it's a joy to connect.
Oh, that's great. I had no idea you even knew who we were. So that's fabulous.
Indeed. Whether it's Uri Geller or the Shroud of Turin, I think Skeptic has done the necessary and yeoman work on all of those.
Yeah. So we have a mutual friend in Jamy and Swiss, and you've followed magic a lot. There's always been an interesting relationship between magicians and skeptics. Of course, Houdini and the Amazing Randy and Jamy and Swiss. There's something about understanding how the mind gets so easily fooled by magicians and then extrapolate from that to, how people fall for cults or con men or whatever.
The extent of credulity, it all goes back. My Jamy and Swiss, dear friend, and I talked about this at time, to the first book about magic in English, The Discovery of Witchcraft, which is all about why there are no actual witches and it's all stunts and tricks. I think that's one of the things that a love of magic, stage magic, brings you, is a skepticism about the supernatural. So, yes.
Yes, it's an interesting teaching tool, but even so, people are still, even skeptics tend to find examples of things. But, if you, the magician, can't explain it, then I'm going to hold out for this one thing, right? This is why Randy never liked to explain exactly how the spoons are bent, because if he tells you it was done this way, but the magician didn't do that.
Oh, well, we can project that, so there can be another way to do it. Now, one of the things you learn hanging out with magicians is that they all know basically the family in which a trick takes place, but they very often don't know exactly the technique by which it's accomplished. So they can be fooled too, even though they know grosso modo the kind of thing that's going on. And it's always fascinating to see that. And of course, the really skilled one always have outs and ways around it, so that when you seem to be on their tail, they know how to escape it. It's a wonderful art form in all of those ways.
Yeah, after we started Skeptic in the early 90s, somebody sent me a copy of a magic magazine, sort of an in-house publication. And there was an ad from Copperfield in which he said, this particular version of this larger trick that we all know, this one's mine. I'm copyrighting this one. You can't use this one.
Yes.
Not the bigger one, but this specific way. I went, oh, that's so interesting.
It's great magicians, card magicians are like... and illusionists are like jazz musicians, right? There's set numbers of, chords. Every jazz musician knows the chords to I Got Rhythm, but what a Ben Webster or a Johnny Hodges can do with it is not like what anybody else can do with it. So anyway, I'm glad. I love magic, and it fascinates me, and it's something I love to think about and write about. And in my previous book, The Real Work, I had a long chapter about going to Las Vegas with my then 13-year-old son, who had fallen in love with card magic and gotten rather good at it, had Jamy and Swiss as his mentor, along with David Blaine. And then and we all went out to Las Vegas together, and I got to watch what happens and learned an enormous amount. And I even had a shorter chapter about a subject that the great Martin Gardner, whom you must have known, Michael.
I knew Martin very well. Yeah.
Yeah, I thought so. It was about, one of the enduring mysteries of magic is the identity of Erdnase, the author of the great book, the expert at the card table, and who Erdnase really was the subject that Martin Gardner, who I knew just slightly and admired enormously, had touched on all the way back in the 1940s. And it's an ongoing mystery. And there was some new evidence and fascinated me. I know we're going far afield here, but it was very much central to my previous book. It fascinated me because of the question of the mystery of intention, right? Knowing what Erdnase is. This is the guy who authored the greatest book on card magic. Was he a magician or was he a cheat? That's a basic question you have to ask, because your response to the book is shaped in large part by which you think was his intention. What was he trying to cover up? Was he a card cheat who was trying to pass as a magician, or a magician trying to pass as a card cheat? So there's a whole chapter about that.
Yeah. Yeah, well, because there's some people like Kreskin that I remember skeptics were not too crazy about, because he sort of hinted that he wasn't doing regular magic tricks, that he had it was real magic, maybe.
Yeah. That's part of the game. And also there are these interesting, hybrids and crossovers. I mentioned my son, Luke, now a philosopher, is worked for David Blaine for several summers. And David, of course, is this fascinating mix of actual real stunts where he learns how to swallow water or hold his breath or put a knife through his hand, along with being an expert magician, who works with Ossie Wind, who I think is maybe the greatest living magician, or the late Johnny Thompson. So there are all of these fascinating hybrid conditions in which magic flourishes.
Yeah. Another one of those weird ones I read about early on was the fake ears, the Indian fake ears. Mm-hmm. And one of them was, you take this like a big knitting needle and you shove it through your bicep or something. Now there's tricks, there's simple ones.
Collapsing needles, right. Yeah.
Yeah. But there was another one where you actually just shove it through your arm.
Yeah, as far as I know, David Blaine does the knife through hand trick. And the trick is put your knife through hand. I have to tell you, it's one of my favorite stories. And I almost called my previous book by this title. When Luke was working for David Blaine, David was working on the bullet catch, and David wanted to do it pure, which is the way it had been done at the turn of the last century, resulting in the deaths of 6 or 7 magicians. Now it's done as a gaffed trick, but David wanted to do it properly, where someone would fire a gun and he would catch the bullet in a titanium cup in his mouth. So I said to Luke, who, as I say, was working with David, what's the trick in the bullet catch? And he said, well, it's a very low velocity bullet and very small caliber projectile, and it's a laser guided rifle, and it's a very strong, powerful cup you hold in your mouth. So I said, oh, so there's no trick to the bullet catch? And he said, yes, Dad, there's a trick to the bullet catch. The trick to the bullet catch is catching the bullet.
But Penn and Teller don't use a cup. They're doing something different.
They're doing a trick. I mean, in the highest sense, a performance that's done. But what I loved about that remark is that it's true about all of us, right? The trick to the bullet catch is catching the bullet. What he meant was there's a moment when you have to simply face the reality that no matter how perfectly rigged this stunt is, you're going to have to face the bullet. And that's true for all of us. I thought of calling the previous book, The Real Work, Catching the Bullet, for a while, but my publisher thought it would be misinterpreted as being about gun control, which I've written about at length as well. So we didn't do it. But I think it's a powerful Zen principle, right? We step up, and ultimately, whether it's public speaking or a magic or any other kind of performance, you have to step up and catch the bullet and face the audience, face the fear. And so I always
you've studied so many different professionals, particularly including musicians. Do magicians spend as much time, the so-called 10,000 hour rule, to master a particular thing like musicians have to, or anybody?
Oh, I think even more. In fact, I don't know any group of artists or artisans who work as hard as magicians do. I remember when Luke was mastering a stack. A stack is the way where cards are all kept in a particular order, and that enables you to do all kinds of things. But the only way you can do it is to memorize 52 discrete items that you have to put in your head. And he would lie in bed at night, just say King of Hearts, Queen of Diamonds, Nine of, and that's the way you learn a stack. So I think magicians not only work harder than any other artists I know, they they are more private. Because they can't. Jamy and Swiss once said to me, the difference between magic and every other art form is that in every other art form, technique has to be transparent, and in magic, it has to be invisible. If I'm listening to Michiko Uchida play the piano, I shouldn't be paying attention to her technique. It's Schubert or Mozart. She wants me to hear. Her technique is transparent in that sense. But when I'm watching Jamy do card magic, it's not that his technique is transparent. It has to be invisible. I can't see any part of it, even though it's as a digital performance, it's every bit as intricate and accomplished as Michiko Uchida's. So I have limitless admiration for magicians in just that way. And they can't talk about it with anyone. You know, I'm a writer, and writers have relatively limited shop talk. We mostly talk about our advances, our annoying publishers, and so on. But we have a little shop talk. Magicians can only talk shop with other magicians. They can't ever talk with civilians about the frustrations and rewards of what they're doing. So that
code that they have is pretty solid, and for good reason, because hanging around magicians, I've been able to figure out some of the things that they've done, and it's not fun to find out. It's like, oh, that's how it's done.
Yes, invariably the most astounding performance is based on extraordinarily simple means, and the joy is seeing how they make it higher. On the other hand, that's true about the piano as well. If you play a little piano or you play guitar, as I do a bit, you know that it's where you press your fingers. It's your soul, your spirit, your sensibility all have to flow into your fingers, but it's fingers that are making the music.
Yeah, then another point on this difference between magic and mentalism, that I've noticed that skeptics who say, yeah, I know Copperfield is not actually making the Statue of Liberty disappear. I know it's a magic trick. But, I saw this guy doing this mentalism thing, and he somehow got the name of the person. And I think maybe he was looking at their eyes and how the eyes were moving. 'Cause I think he might have seen Banachek's thing where he, says, now think of the card. Now stare at the hand. And he moves his hand around like as if he can read the person's. This is all bullshit, of course.
Well, fascinating thing that my son, who, as I say, was a magician, then became a musician, now getting a PhD in philosophy, and I think is going back to music eventually, pointed out to me is that we tend to be, and this speaks very much to skeptics, we tend to be bad reporters of what we see. So inevitably, when you ask someone, what did David Blaine do with Kanye West or whomever he's performing with, and you say, he was nowhere near him, and yet Kanye West knew how many fingers he was holding up at any one time. How did he do that? And inevitably, when you actually watch what happened, he did get near him, or he didn't get near him. In other words, we misreport, we over-report, I guess you could say, over-imaginatively report what we've experienced. And very often, when you have not so much a jaundiced eye as just a practiced eye, you see that what we remember and report is not what actually happened.
Yeah, Martin Gardner made that point. Oh, no, it was Ray Hyman about Uri Geller. That when Uri Geller first broke on the scene, he started reading stories and he would meet people. And the person would say, well, he never touched the key or the spoon. He never put his hand on it. And then he come to find out that Geller told the story in the current performance where he was failing or whatever. He said, but last night, here's what I did. Yeah. And then the people would report what he reported he did the previous night, not what actually happened that day.
Exactly. And it's astounding that, people's will to believe and their capacity to warp their minds unknowingly, if not unwillingly. It's willingly in the sense that they want to believe, but they do. So it's very instructive to hang around magicians too, exactly as you said, because almost invariably, when you say to someone, how did you do that? And you find out how it's done, and you don't say, oh my God, what a brilliant idea. You just say, oh, Jesus, it was that simple?
Yeah.
That's all you did?
One of Randy's famous moments was with Barbara Walters on one of those shows, 2020 maybe, where she has Geller bend her key or whatever, and then they bring Randy out. And she says he never touched the key. So they play it back, and there he takes the key for just a moment. It's like, and she's like, "Whoop!" But that's not the way it happened. He's like, "Yeah, we're watching the video of what happened."
Exactly.
And it must just be, I want it to be true, or it takes the magic away, or something like that. I was on a Scientific American cruise once, where I was one of the lecturers. So everybody there is, super skeptical and whatnot. And a guy at the dinner table is telling me about spoon bending. He goes, "No, I know Randy and the tricks and stuff, but I saw this guy do it, and he bent it in a way, and I knew where he was going. That the neck was twisted this way rather than just bent over." So, and Banachek showed me how to do this. So as he's telling me, I take the spoon off the table and I do the little move under the table. And as he's finishing the story, I said, "Did it look anything like this?" He's like, "Oh crap, really?"
Yeah, exactly.
So I said, now that Copperfield doesn't make the Statue of Liberty really disappear, right? Oh, of course. Why would you think Geller, or a mentalist, somehow has the actual magic, and he's not just doing another trick that you don't happen to know?
Yeah, but that's universally true. I mentioned, because I remember reading about it in Skeptic, the Shroud of Turin, right? Mm. And there's a case, right, where when the thing first appeared, the guy who discovered it, the ecclesiastical authority said, "This is a fraud. I know how the guy who painted it, and we know how he painted it. It's a fraud." Doesn't matter, right? It carries on, no matter how many times it's debunked, and no matter who debunks it. People's desire to believe will always trump any amount of rational analysis.
Yeah. Okay, let's talk about your new book, All That Happiness Is.
That would be great.
All right, what is it? Give us the
So this book was my attempt to write. It began as a commencement address at McGill University, where I studied back too many years ago, and then collected, additional moss, as a rolling stone of rhetoric always will. And basically what I wanted to do was a theme that was already implicit, or actually spelled out to some degree, in The Real Work, my previous book. But I wanted to write, above all, about accomplishment, and how much our happiness in life is really rooted in accomplishment. Because if you think about it, Michael, and I'm putting aside here things like a child being born, which is an accomplishment of a kind, or watching that same child get married 25 years later, which I'm in the midst of doing right now. If you think about it, almost all of our happiest moments in life come from, not from sort of stimulation, but from absorption. Those moments when we get so engaged in something outside ourselves that we transcend ourselves. And they can be very simple things. The example I give at the beginning of this little book is when I was 12 years old, I disappeared into my bedroom in Montreal with a $40 folk guitar, and I taught myself to play 4 chords. When I say I taught myself, I mean I sat there on the bed day after day, hour after hour, with a big book of Beatles songs in front of me. I wanted to be a Beatle, and how else were you going to do it? And I learned. I actually can show you if you like.
Yeah.
Since we're on. I had a guitar, not unlike this one. This is my son's Taylor, a much better guitar. But I just bent my fingers around these frets until I could form a D, and then the much harder G, where you have to put your little finger all the way around here, and then finally a C, right? And it took me, as I say, the better part of 2 weeks to get there. But once I got there, all the world was open to me. I discovered that the songs I loved, the harmonies of the songs I loved, were right there under my fingertips, and that a whole blossoming world of development was available to me. You learn that as you go up the scale, right, you go from a D, but the E isn't an E major, it's an E minor, which is beautiful, right? And then you go to an F sharp minor, and all of these beautiful chord progressions that the Beatles used are just right there, literally under your fingers. And that feeling of accomplishment after enormous perseverance is, in the most realistic and practical and undramatic sense, the foundation for everything I've done since. Now, I am actually a songwriter. I've written a lot of songs for the theater, but as a lyricist, not as a composer. So I'm not a musician and have no pretensions to be one, or even a good guitar player. All around on either side of me in this room are my son's guitars. He's a professional guitar player, and like any good guitar player, he has lots of different guitars for different occasions. and he left them here with me when he went off to graduate school. And like every guitar player, he basically said, Dad, you can play them anytime you want to, just never touch them. So I'm surrounded by guitars that I can play but don't touch. But despite my own incapacities as a musician, that experience is the foundation for everything I've done since, because it taught me that passionate perseverance would put the world in your hands. And the feeling of escaping from myself into a world of ordered sound was like nothing else I'd ever experienced. And it's not peculiar to music or to the guitar. That's where my generation, yours too, I suspect, naturally began. You could do it in other ways. The wonderful Scottish poet who talks just about origami. He discovered origami. Don Patterson is his name. And he discovered origami at exactly that same age, 12 or 13. Kid from a poor working class neighborhood in Scotland. And he became fascinated with making origami elephants. And it consumed him in exactly the same way. Don Patterson didn't become an origami artist. He became a poet, an editor, and an aphorist. But he feels exactly the same way, that everything he has put on paper since has as its invisible foundation the paper elephant that he made when he was 12. We could go on and on. My wife had the same experience, learning how to sew patterns, turn these very abstract butterick patterns into clothes that she wanted to wear. And I think that is what I call accomplishment. Those are all of the inner-directed, in some ways, unrewarded activities that we do in some way for their own sake. And in my experience, they are the most important things that we ever accomplish. Magic, we've been talking about for all this time, is a perfect example of it, right? Kids, 12-year-olds, 13-year-olds, get obsessed with card tricks in the same way. They rarely, or almost never, go on to become magicians, but not only do the cards give their nervous energy a siphon, a place to go, but exactly that ability to do the Erdnase color change or to execute Triumph, the great Divernon card effect, gives them confidence in everything else they do. Everything else they do collegially, erotically, and in every other way. There's no firmer foundation than a special shuffle. And so I wanted to draw people's attention to the way that if there is a consistent principle of happiness, it lies in the effect of absorption through accomplishment. And I wanted to contrast it, and talk about that next, with what I think of as the tyranny of achievement in our culture and in our country particularly, where instead of being introduced to the possibilities of accomplishment, kids are driven towards the narrow rat race of achievement.
Yeah, that's nicely put. So absorption from within versus achievement by recognition from outside sources is one of your cuts of distinction here. Yeah. But okay, just hypothetically, let's say instead of becoming a professional writer for the New Yorker, and you're paid, and you have a deadline, and you get the 1099s at the end of the year, you file your tax returns, you're a pro. What if you had become a musician, a professional guitar player, and you went on the road and you performed, and that's how you made your living? Would that move it from accomplishment to achievement? Because it's now externally rewarded? Well, as I say in the book,
at some point in our lives, I'm having these conversations with my son right now, accomplishment, no matter how rich, has to become practical, and it has to become a vocation of some kind. Those of us who are very fortunate in life get to turn one of our accomplishments into an ambition, into a vocation. I would rather have been the musician that I didn't become. But
Are you sure?
Yeah, actually, I kind of am. I mean, the thing that gives me greatest satisfaction in my middle-aged years is songwriting, and I do now for the theater. And I think I would have liked to have been a musician. I love writing. You know, writing is what comes naturally to me in a certain sense, and that's a whole other conversation about what's natural gift, what's persevered pattern. But in some certain ways, I'm a natural writer, and I love to write. I'm one of the rare writers you will meet who looks forward to writing, never says it's a problem, doesn't sigh and get distracted. I just love the act of flipping open my laptop and starting to form sentences. But I think that had I become a musician, I inevitably would have been one of those musicians who keeps journals, the way the great sax player Paul Desmond did, or writes letters. I was just reading last night the letters of Alec Wilder, a great, if unfairly forgotten, composer of the American 20th century, of songs and of concert pieces as well. And he poured his whole amateur soul into his writing, into letter writing, because that was his secondary passion. It's one of the points I make in the book. It's sort of the whole second half of this very little book is about the power of secondary passions, which we all need to have. And I give the example, it's a beautiful idiom in French. You refer to the violin d'Ingres, the violin of Ingres. Ingres was the greatest 19th century, neoclassical painter. He did those famous odalisques and great portraits, a magician with paint, but all he cared about was his violin, and he poured himself into his violin playing. Everybody agrees that his violin playing was not nearly at the level of his painting, but it was hugely important for him because it's having a secondary passion that fuels our primary passion, our primary vocation. And I don't just mean that, Michael, sort of anecdotally. I think it's a powerful psychological principle. When we start doing something like learning guitar chords, there's a beautiful kind of wheel of rewards that goes on, and we get, if we're lucky, or if we just persevere, all you really need to do is persevere, we get into that state, which I call absorption, and some psychologists call the flow. And it's not unrelated to what George Lucas calls the force, that sense of being, again, outside ourselves in an activity that is inherently rewarding. And over time, that flow state becomes harder and harder for us to achieve through our primary passion, through the accomplishment that became our avocation. It naturally happens that way because what tends to happen as time goes on and we become professionalized is that we no longer see the scale of our accomplishment. We can only see the space between our accomplishment and our ambition for it. When I sit down to write, I flip open that laptop. I want every sentence to have the sensual acuity of John Updike and the verbal epigrammatic clarity of Virginia Woolf and the wise guy humor of A.J. Liebling. And it doesn't. I'm a good writer, but I always see how much better I wish it could be. With our secondary passions, we are more easily able to get in the flow. When Ingres was playing his violin, the progress he was making was more rewarding to him than the progress he was making as a painter because he was already on such a high summit that it was hard to get higher. So in that way, it's a long answer, but I do think our secondary passions, each of us has a violin d'Ingres, an Ingres violin that I think is fuels everything else we do professionally.
Yeah, I guess what I'm asking is, had you gone the other way and now you were at your age a professional musician, and since a lot of the online money is dried up, you have to go on the road 200 days a year or something, if you would be then looking back at the time when you were blissfully in your library writing and enjoying that, and now you're on the road and it's a grind and you have to do it,
well,
and it's lost that.
One of the things it's funny you asked this, Michael, because as I said before, and not to be overly disclosing, but I'm having this conversation on an ongoing, almost daily basis with my wonderful son Luke, who's a wonderful 13-year-old magician, a protege of Jamy Swiss, and then became a very fine guitar player, and then took a turn into philosophy, and now is thinking hard about going back to music. And the truth is that in every field at this moment, including my own, it's never been easier to be a writer and never been harder to be a professional writer. When I started out, there was no internet, there was no Medium, there was no Substack. Nowadays, you can write an essay and you throw it out like a message in a bottle into a vast ocean filled with similar messages and similar bottles. When I was starting out, if you didn't have access to the print, to a printing press someplace, you didn't have anything. Same thing is true about being a musician. It's never been easier to be a musician. You can craft songs at the level of, going back to what the Beatles struggled to do on Sergeant Pepper, you can now do on your laptop with no difficulty at a much higher technical level. And you can put it out on SoundCloud or YouTube or anywhere you want. And theoretically, it's available literally to millions of people with the press of a button. Of course, it's never been harder to be a professional musician for just those reasons, because the extent of music has disaggregated the music industry, obviously. So now all the musicians I know, including very famous ones, can only make their living on the road. They go on the road and they don't sell records anymore. They go on the road, they sell merchandise, and that's how you do it, is by, it's why the Rolling Stones, even the Rolling Stones, are back out on the road at the age of 80, because they have, expensive upkeep, and selling the back catalog won't do it anymore. So yes, I think it's never been easier to be an artist, never harder to be a professional artist. But that's kind of true right across the board. I don't think it's peculiar to music. It's true about writing. And it's, I don't mean to sound too complacent about it, Michael. I've been very fortunate in my life. I have to find a home and an audience when I was quite young. But we all roll the dice and see where we can do. And there are very few tasks in life that don't bend themselves to perseverance. And I think that passionate perseverance is the open sesame of everything. I really do believe that.
Yeah, well, let's use Mick Jagger as an example. Surely he doesn't need the money anymore. He doesn't have to go on the road. Mm-hmm. He must still love doing the process. So it's back to your accomplishment versus achievement. He's achieved everything a professional musician could ever ask for. So he's still doing it. Just like Elon Musk says, well, I could have just gone and spent my time at the beach, with my 200 million or 400 million, whatever he got from PayPal. But, I want to go to Mars. I want to, change the electric car industry. And
I want to mess up Twitter and turn it into a sewer of ugliness. Yeah, I think that's true. I think that the very successful musicians who I do know get the charge of accomplishment, the presence of the flow, the escape from self in making music that they've always done. And you see that. I'm, like any Rolling Stones fan, you're either primarily a Mick fan or primarily a Keith fan. Mm-hmm. And I'm primarily, as a guitarist, I'm primarily a Keith fan. And when you see him playing those same open G chords again for must be almost literally the millionth time, you see that he's alive when he's doing it, that it's his accomplishment in life. So I think that those two things do go together, and they refuel it. I also think it's true that the music business in the time that I've been alive is altered more than any business I know in that way. We're lucky, knock wood, or I should say knock wood, as my father would have done. We're lucky because for reasons that are not entirely explicable to me, the book business, publishing, has not gotten disaggregated in the way that the music business did. I guess because people really don't want to read individual sentences from a book. They want to read the book. They don't even want to read individual chapters from a book in the way they really just want to hear one song from your new album. Rather, they don't really want to buy it and then listen to both sides the way we did so studiously when we were kids. But people still want to read books. They buy books, and they still want to hold handsome little books in their hands and turn the pages.
Yeah, I don't think ebooks or audiobooks will ever completely displace or even get to half of what print books are. I think it's still less than half combined.
Yeah, it's significantly less than half. And 10 years ago, 15 years ago, nobody predicted that, nor nobody safely foresaw that.
Right. Could be something in human psychology of just holding the book rather than just reading digital sentences on a screen. How do you think about, let's just think about nature, nurture, and creativity and achievement and all that. Remember Malcolm Gladwell's book where he used the 10,000 hour, made famous the 10,000 hour rule, and then used the Beatles as an example. And, his critics said, well, how many garage bands put their 10,000 hours in and they still stink? They didn't become the Beatles. There's obviously something else, natural talent or whatever. How do you think about those?
I'll tell you a funny story, right? I love Malcolm. He's one of my favorite people and dearest friends in our family. He's known as Not That You're Not Dead Malcolm, because when he would come over for dinner when the kids were little, the kids afterwards would just be dazzled, and they say, Malcolm is the most interesting conversationalist. Not that you're not dead. Malcolm always finds the one right illustration to make his points. Not that you don't, Dad. Um, so Luke, my son, I mentioned several times now, got interested in the 10,000 hours, was reading Malcolm, and he got interested, and he came to me and said, Dad, do you think this thing about 10,000 hours is true? And I said, well, I don't know. He said, when did you start writing seriously? And I said, well, when your mom and I came to New York from Canada, 1980, I started writing seriously. We tried to calculate how many hours, how many weeks, all of that. And Luke was doing the math, and he said, Dad, if you're reporting this correctly, your 10,000 hours were up in May of 1986. And I laughed because that was when my first piece appeared in the New Yorker in May of 1986. That was my first hit record, so to speak, my first piece in the New Yorker. So I called up Malcolm and I said, you magician, how did you know this? And he said something, it's exactly what we were talking about, how, it sounds astonishing until you realize what it really is, as with a magic trick. He said, people don't count their lives in hours, we count them in years. And 10,000 hours is 6 years of work. And if you think about it at all, any professional program that you undertake is a 6-year program. From the time you start at medical school until the time that you're entrusted with a patient on your own, 6 years. From the time you start at law school to the time you're pleading a case on your own without the immediate superior, 6 years. Every PhD program I've ever been aware of is a 6-year program, on and on and on. And I think that that's true. So to answer your question, yes, of course, it's obviously true that the Beatles had enormous natural talent, and it's a real thing, but they would not have been able to express it had they not played for 6 years, from 1956 to 1962, literally 6 years, from when the Quarrymen began and the 57 John Paul meet, in 63 they become the biggest stars in the world. It's 6 years. And if you devote yourself to those 6 years, and I tell this to my assistants, my apprentices all the time, it's very unlikely that there won't be a place for you in the field you love. Now, you won't become the Beatles. None of us become the Beatles. You might not become Malcolm Gladwell, but I would be shocked if there's not, with 6 years of passionate perseverance, that there's not a place for you someplace in the world you want to be in, wherever that is.
Yeah. So, after you get that cut, then let's say among physicians or lawyers or writers or philosophers or whoever, there's always a few that stand out more than others. And it can't just be IQ because they're all smart, right?
Yeah.
Everybody's 2 or 3 standard deviations above the mean once you graduate from medical school or law school or you get your PhD or whatever. There's something else in there, creativity.
Well, what I would call it, Michael, and I wrote about this in this book, in All That Happiness Is, but also in my previous book, The Real Work. It's voice. It's an original voice. I had the opportunity when I was on the road with The Real Work, and I visited 30 cities. I'm the Willie Loman of American literature, going from town to town with my little suitcase of goods. I got the chance to go to Tulsa, Oklahoma, and do something with the cooperation of the Bob Dylan Museum, or the Bob Dylan Center, I think they call it there. Dylan gave all of his artifacts to this wonderful museum in Tulsa. And there's a letter from Dylan in there where he talks about, I think it's in the context of hearing a cover of one of his songs, that he knows he's not a good singer in the conventional sense, but he's a great breather. And if you think about it, that's true about Bob Dylan, right? We listen to his singing for that way he breathes his way through a song. He found a voice that was like no one else's. And I think of the people you're talking about, when somebody stands out in that way, and it's certainly true about writing. There's a moment, I wrote about it in an even earlier book, At the Stranger's Gate, the moment when I found my voice. And it was a specific moment in 1982 or 1983. And that's the moment when you cease being one of a bunch of aspirants and you become, you find your vocation. So I think what stands out almost invariably is not a gift in the technical sense. And any musician will tell you this too, right? It's not that Django Reinhardt was the most technically accomplished of jazz guitarists, just as you hear his sound and it sounds like nothing else on earth. That's what, or Lester Young or Ben Webster. It's the moment you hear them, you know who it is, right? And that's what is the power of human communication, is the capacity of an instrument in that case, or of sentences on paper or cards in your hand to take on a wholly individual character. And that, I think, is what it's the possession of a voice, the discovery of a voice that distinguishes.
How did these people find that original voice? Is it a Darwinian method of just trying lots of different things and you see what works?
Yeah. I think it's just exactly. That's what you're doing in those 10,000 hours.
Yeah.
Is you're forming, in the case of a writer, you're forming sentences until you find one that sounds like nobody else and that sounds in some sense like you. I remember my first sentence of that kind, which is so banal, you won't believe it. But I was working at the Frick Art Reference Library, and I wrote, I am a student at the Institute of Fine Arts, and I work part-time at the Frick Art Reference Library. And there was something about the simplicity and the additive nature of that sentence, which was fatuous and dumb as it sounds, was for me a whole rebellion against the kind of super hyper-argued prose that I'd been encouraged to do as a graduate student at the Institute of Fine Arts, and discovering the power of writing with simple ands and nouns rather than with buts and hysterical argumentation, for me was, as soon as I did it, I said, oh, this is the path I need to follow. And I think Bob Dylan, realized, oh, I don't have to sing like someone else. I can sing like me. And I think it's true of dancers. It's true of musicians. It's true of magicians. And it's exactly the distinction we always make in every field between somebody who's technically expert and empty and someone who is, excuse me, no more technically expert, but unique. Richard Avedon, the great photographer, was blessedly a very dear friend, a kind of adoptive father of mine and my wife's. And Dick once said to me, the greatest, most famous photographer in the world, he said, I can teach you everything I know about photography in 20 minutes. Like every technical thing I know about photography, I could teach you in 20 minutes. All the rest is your interaction with people. All the rest is just about your relationships with people.
Yeah, interesting. I would imagine that's all true for comedians as well.
Mm-hmm.
Constantly working, trying, tweaking. This is why they don't want you recording their performances in these little clubs, because now you can just post them online. Everybody could see it because they're just working different techniques to see what works before they do their Netflix special or whatever.
Yeah, exactly. And that's what we respond to. When we start laughing at Chris Rock or Jerry Seinfeld, whoever we love, it's the sound of them that delights us even before the content. If it was just the sound, we might become disappointed. But it's why other comedians can do impressions of comedians. It's because they have literally a distinctive voice.
Yeah. I remember just kind of reading some of the text of stand-up comedians. It's like, if I said this, it wouldn't be funny.
Yep.
Like, use the exact same words. It has nothing to do with the exact words or the twist or whatever.
No, it's point of view. It's the outward extension of an entire personality, and that's what turns us on. It's not the jokes, literally.
Right. Yeah, I saw George Carlin once live in Vegas, and he was doing his usual stuff on language, and then in the middle of the show, he kind of shifts over to this other story about his dog or something, and it wasn't funny. And like halfway through it, he just stops. He goes, "Okay, never mind." And then he's like, "Oh, okay. Well, what was that?" Well, he was just trying out something.
He was trying out something that as Jerry Seinfeld says, "Is this anything?" That's what comedians. Is this anything? All right. So my dog and I went. Writers do the same thing.
Yeah. And I saw Leno once in Redondo Beach on a Sunday night, where I guess he had a contract with this small comedy club to just work material, and he had a huge stack of index cards, and he was just kind of riffing through them. And then later that week on the Tonight Show, I heard some of them, but only a couple.
The ones that worked, right?
Yeah, the ones that worked.
Yeah, I think that's true. And again, not to be banal about it, that's the nature of accomplishment, right? Is exactly the pleasure you take in working your way through all the things that don't work in order to find the ones that do. And that's when you do, that's a huge high, huge self-generated high.
Now, most of us guys have dreams about being professional rock musicians because it's like the coolest job ever. Why would your son give that up and want to be a PhD philosopher, for God's sakes?
He's given us some second thoughts now for that reason. As I said, he switched from being a magician to a musician when he was 16 because he discovered, and he was not the first to discover this, that girls have zero interest in card tricks. and they're very interested in guitar players. I think that things are allied for him, and to answer seriously, and I think it's exactly the point that I'm trying to make in this little book, is that being good at music, being good at guitar playing, being good at cards was a wonderful foundation for him to, so to speak, match wits with Wittgenstein, to understand that there was nothing. I have a beautiful photograph of him somewhere in this space, of him standing at the edge of the ocean one summer with Heidegger's Being and Time in his hands. And, he literally couldn't put it down even to go in swimming. And I think that that led him into philosophy in that natural way. And because, I think the other thing that makes philosophy unique as a field is that it's the one place where you can ask the foundational questions for the rest of your life,
of
not
everything.
Not just how do you do it, but why are we doing it? You ask again and again, what is and why is it? And most of us don't spend a lot of time asking, what is and what isn't. And philosophers do that, sometimes to the exclusion of all else. And I think that for somebody whose mind takes that kind of, I always think of and I think I say this someplace in this book, there are two kinds of minds. And anybody who tells you there are two kinds of anything is
right.
Dubious. But for the moment, let's say two kinds of mind. I think it's true. Horizontal and vertical. I have a horizontal mind. My mind races, as you're probably experiencing, from subject to subject along a horizontal axis where Yellow Submarine is here and Wittgenstein is there, but they're all connected. Other people have what I think of as a vertical mind, which is the ability to plumb deep and tenaciously into a single subject until they've got it from the roots up to the very tip top of the tree. I think great scientists, for the most part, have that kind of vertical mind. They have tenacious mental muscles in understanding a problem from roots to treetops, whereas us essayists tend to have horizontal minds. We love the joy of leaping between seemingly unrelated things and showing their surprising and sometimes comic relationship.
But again, back to this difference between internal and external rewards, I guess, or motivations. So let's say your son gets a PhD. Well, that is an external recognition of your 6 years, let's say, of work done there. And doesn't that at least in part, enhance the feeling of accomplishment? I did this. Not many people have done it. And the fact that somebody outside of myself is recognizing it is part of the accomplishment.
Yeah, but how many people do you know, Michael, with PhDs who are not terribly happy and not really glowing about most of them, I'd say, right?
Yeah.
And it's not just getting a PhD, though. We live in a time when getting a PhD in the humanities is a more ambivalent reward than it once was. But nonetheless, I think it's all of those kinds of professional laurels tend to be short-lived. I've been lucky enough to win some awards, and I felt great the moment I heard about it. And it's very short-lasting. And mine are at a low level, but they always used to say about Saul Bellow, finally won the Nobel Prize for Literature, that he was always miserable every November because he couldn't win it again. Somebody else was going to win it that year. And I think with that, with ambitious people, particularly with all of us, that basic Buddhist insight that those kinds of material exterior, if you like, rewards tend to be limited in their endurance, that we tend not to, we get a PhD and you're glad on graduation day, but it doesn't solve your problems in life. Whereas the accomplishment that it might reflect, your ability to read Wittgenstein and Bernard Williams and engage day after day with minds that you think are worth engaging with, that's a permanent accomplishment, and I think it's some kind of thing that
that's a good point. All right, another twist on this, reading from your book. Yet another objection to my plea against the tyranny of achievement is simply that accomplishment is just the name people of good fortune give to things that they have the privilege of doing, which achievement has already put them in a place to pursue. Accomplishment is merely the rich kid's name for free time.
Yes. Yeah, I wanted to. One of the things that my own academic background taught me is to try and make the counter arguments as strong as you possibly can. In my book, Thousand Small Sanities, The Moral Adventure of Liberalism, the thing I was proudest of is a chapter why the left hates liberalism and a chapter why the right hates liberalism. And I really poured myself into those thinkers and those arguments and trying to make them as powerful as I possibly could. And I recognize that a reasonable objection to the view of happiness and of accomplishment and of the false opium of achievement that I'm offering here is exactly that. You say, well, that's just for the lucky few. I never use the word privilege, but I like the word fortunate, for the fortunate few. But I don't think that's true. I don't think that's true. I think that, in fact, that the reality is that the more possibility there is, coming back to the Beatles were not fortunate in that way. They were poor working class boys, but they found a sense of meaning in the rock and roll guitar that nothing else would offer them. And I think it's terribly condescending to people who don't have the access to elite education to think that they therefore have less appetite for accomplishment. All of everything we know tells us just the opposite. Louis Armstrong was an orphan without any kind of education and became maybe the greatest American artist, and took perpetual pleasure in the simple accomplishment of playing the trumpet. So I reject that idea that it's only the fortunate few who pursue it. But beyond that, as a matter of a social program, nothing could be more important than to make access to accomplishment more widespread. I have many sisters. My sister Allison, who I think you know, all of my sisters are accomplished academics. My sister Allison is a psychologist, and she wrote once, I think with great justice, that if we taught kids softball the way we teach them science, they would hate softball as much as they hate science. Right. In other words, we don't put, in effect, a bat and ball in their hands as scientists. We make them learn it by rote. And that's not how people learn. So at the dumbest but most significant possible level, Michael, one of the things I wanted this book to be is a kind of manifesto for arts education. And nothing could be more important than that we keep music and drawing, the arts and drama in the schools, which, of course, there is happening less and less. Yeah.
Okay, let's talk about the role of, how lives turn out, genes, environment, and luck, the role of luck and timing. The Beatles and their timing, or I think it was Malcolm Gladwell who made the point about, had Bill Gates been born 10 years earlier, 10 years later, he would have missed that whole revolution. Same thing with the search engine, with the Google boys. The timing was everything there.
Yeah, look, and when we run our own lives back, we say, oh my God, I was so lucky to have gotten into the New Yorker in May of 1986. Rather than 10 years later or something, though I was still writing for it then. And of course, good fortune affects us all, and we would be blind and arrogant if we overlooked the degree to which luck and what's called success interlink. But I think that I think that it's easy to overrate it. And to me, I don't know anything about Bill Gates, but I think had Paul McCartney been born 10 years earlier, he would have become Frank Lesser rather than becoming Paul McCartney, rather than becoming a Beatle. That I think that talent flows into the channels provided for. Those are, in a certain sense, unanswerable questions because we can't, run the tape back and try it again. But to the degree we can, one of the things I think we notice is that people of talent tend to have first, second, and third acts. Not all, but a surprising number. Shakespeare started off writing popular comedy for large crowds, and then he turned to even more popular tragedy for a more select audience, and he ended his life writing masks for an aristocratic audience. And you gave him a task, and he used his enormous talent and his incredible work ethic, his capacity for accomplishment, to do it. And, Shakespeare's also a nice example because it's clear that all of the beautiful sonnets he wrote for himself. He wrote because they were ways of organizing harsh and perplexing and tantalizing and sometimes delicious emotions. And that was just part of the unspooling web of meaning that he offered to himself and then to the world.
Yeah. There's another form of luck in terms of how personalities develop and intelligence. we know from behavior geneticists, research by people like your sister, Allison, that, a lot of this, you didn't choose. It's not hard work. That half of probably 70% of IQ is heritable. And same thing with the big five personality dimensions, to what extent you're high in openness to experience or conscientiousness, extroversion, introversion, and so forth. Identical twins raised apart, are almost identical in IQ and personality dimensions. And so you didn't choose any of that. So let's say you just happen to be high in need of achievement, and you get up every morning and you're just filled with energy. I want to get out there into the world and make my mark. And some people they don't feel that way. So you can't exactly pat yourself on the back saying, well, I feel like, I'm a high achiever because I work hard. Well, one reason you work hard is because, well, you inherited that from your parents, and then maybe your parents set up an environment in which, that was nourished also.
I certainly think that's true. And there's nothing more obnoxious than the people who have had success, fairly or not, who regard that then as proof. You're talking about Elon Musk, right? And regard that then as proof that they're equally expert in everything, right? And we all recognize that that's not so. But we also know the reverse, I think, Michael, and that is that there are lots of people, kids who have every kind of talent and every kind of gift who never harvest the talent. And we all know that, and we all have experienced that. And that's just as mysterious, right? Not just, how it is that heritable things are inherited, but how seemingly heritable things aren't inherited, how people of great capacity and talent are left unable to express it. So I think that the winds of fate indeed blow us in many directions, but they blow us forward and they blow us back. And in one lifetime, I think, behind me are biographies of 100 people. And one of the things you learn from biography is, yes, the power of good luck, but also you learn the power of ill fortune, of the one wrong decision that gifted people make, and the one incapacity that they're left with. So I think it's, I think it's true that we owe an enormous amount to things that we have no control over, and we all ought to be appropriately humble in the face of that truth. But I also think it's true that that there's no justice in it, and if you're looking for justice in that process, you'll always be disappointed. You should just be grateful that they haven't got you yet. What was it Sophocles said? That
right.
Nobody should congratulate themselves on their life until it's over, because at any moment it can all go wrong.
Well, this is an actual term, is the just world theory, mostly embraced by conservatives, that, the poor are poor because they didn't work hard, and the rich are rich because they worked hard and they're creative or whatever. And just discounts all these things we're talking about.
Look, we're all, the fundamental reality of human life is human death. And I say that in the book. Fundamental reality of our existence is our mortality. The most gifted person I ever knew, my great teacher, Kirk Varnado, to whom the real work was dedicated, got colon cancer when he was in his 40s and was dead within 6 years. There's no just world at work there. It was wildly unjust and cruel. Nobody caused it. It happened, and there are flower pots waiting to fall on all of our heads from the 30th floor as we walk down the street, and that should make us, A, humble, and B, grateful, which we never are sufficiently. But I think that anybody who doesn't recognize that the fact of mortality, and it's one of the things I think that also is one of the reasons why I believe so much in the power of accomplishment, is exactly what can we do to make meaning in the fact of that great abyss of non-meaning from which we came, from whence we came, and to which we will return. And the answer is we make songs, we make paragraphs, we make sentences. And more than even that they give us a living, because we can't guarantee that they will, they give us meaning. They supply meaning. And our capacity to make meaning for ourselves is, I think, the only weapon human beings have against the fact of mortality.
Well, that I always think maybe meaning is a better word than happiness. What is it people want? Well, happiness or subjective well-being or whatever. But what is it really? Because most of what people do is, it doesn't put a happy glow on your face as you're walking around all day. That's not the point. It's to do something that's challenging, purposeful, meaningful, and at the end of the day, you feel better about yourself even if you were miserable most of the day doing whatever it is you were doing.
Yeah, that's exactly the point. The book is called All That Happiness Is, but I wouldn't argue with that gloss on it, that elaboration of it, that what the book is really saying is happiness as we experience in life is essentially our search for meaning and our pursuit of it. And that's the most reliable source of happiness that our existence provides us. I'll buy that. I'll buy that reading.
And then last question on the how lives turn out. In your own life, I mean, your sister Allison is incredibly successful, and she has stood out amongst, the zillion psychologists that write and so on. And I didn't even know you had other sisters that are also doing this. Yes. And your son is trying to decide he should be a PhD philosopher, a professional musician. Oh, okay. So what is it that your parents did that you look back and go, that really nudged me in the right, or did you have mentors or teachers or somebody that guided you?
I was blessed. It's a great question. Through the pandemic, I was writing a family memoir called Just Us. That was my own attempt to understand my own past. I was blessed to have great teachers. Kirk Varnado, whom I mentioned, Richard Avedon, whom I mentioned, very varied group. But finally, it all goes back to the family dinner table. I was blessed to have my parents were both young intellectuals when we were born. When Allison was born, when I was born, they weren't even 20 yet. They were ascending the ladder of the academic profession, but even more, they were alive at a time when what we now call cognitive science was coming to life. My mom was a linguist. My father was an English professor, and they were alive, enraptured by those things, and they shared it with us. And the core mass, the core ritual of our lives was the dinner table where we argued and bullied and came back. And I'm told Allison and I were very horribly Bigfoot creatures to the middle kids, and we indulged the babies, the two youngest ones, more. So yes, Henry James said once that the only identity he really had was as a member of the James family. And I grew up with that very strong feeling. It's an ambivalent feeling. It's not always a healthy feeling, but it was certainly the sense that was where my citizenship was rooted. And the best side of that, I hope, I tried to pass on to my kids, the sense that dinner was a sacred time for food, because I love to cook, as my mom did, but even more for sharing, for argument, for bringing out the day's events and running them past. And if I could wish something on everyone, it would be a music education, whether they ever become a musician or not, and a good dinner time. I wrote a book once called The Table Comes First that was about the power of the table, not just to delight us, nurture us, and so nourish us, but even more important, to provide an arena, a kind of little domestic agora where we could argue out the world. And that's where I did it with my brothers and sisters and parents.
Nice.
And
Are you following this debate and concern about the anxious generation, kids these days, on screens all the time rather than more interactive?
Well, yes, but yes, of course I worry about it. But I also am old enough to remember when people said exactly the same things about television when you and I were growing up. And now we go into our teenagers' bedroom and say, would you please get off your phone and come watch television with the rest of the family?
Right.
So there's always some technological trap and temptation.
There was a meme going around Twitter last year of, everybody on their phone on a subway. Everybody's, it's like, oh, this is just terrible. And then the next picture was like from the 1950s. Everybody's got a newspaper on the subway.
Exactly.
That's really funny. Okay, I mentioned the just world theory, mostly endorsed by conservatives. The opposite of that, the unjust world theory, is mostly embraced by, progressives maybe, that, you are largely determined by your social class or your race or whatever. And, there's next to no chance of succeeding if you happen to be bad luck and born into one of these groups. Therefore, the government needs to, address these inequalities. And so we have equality of outcome, something like that. I'm kind of characterizing the issue there, but as a transition to your liberalism, I mean, is that where liberalism has gone, and maybe it's not the kind of liberalism you grew up with?
Well, look, my we were talking about my family, right? My parents were blessed to be, poor Jewish kids of immigrant parents in Philadelphia. And the public schools in Philadelphia in those years, 1940s, 50s, were terrific. My father remembers having many PhDs on the faculty of the high school that he went to. And they pushed him forward, told him he could go to college, which not only no one in his family had ever done, they hadn't even thought about ever doing. My mom was even better. She had a math fellowship. And so we had structures that empowered bright kids from poor families, in plain English, to get good educations and to go on. Schools were less expensive. My dad could work his way through college, which you couldn't do. You went to Penn, couldn't work your way through an Ivy League school anymore. So there was a whole structure in place after the Second World War, which was designed to empower poor kids into great schools. Some of that structure is still in place, and we're grateful for it. My daughter just graduated from one of those schools, and she had a good, nice representative class. The kids in her first dorm room were the daughter of a dry cleaner, an Asian dry cleaner in the suburbs of Chicago, right? Not from any kind of a particularly fortunate background. So those things I think are essential. And yes, that's part of what liberalism demands is public works. We build sewers for the common good. We create universities for the common good. I think that's a terribly important part of what liberalism is, and it's one of the things that distinguishes it from libertarianism or from what I think of as false liberalism, what's sometimes called classic liberalism, which leans far too much on individualism without recognizing that the great accomplishment of liberal societies has been to provide means for people to get educated, to find themselves in all of those ways. John Stuart Mill is my first hero among all others. And the great thing about Mill is that he was the greatest apostle of individual liberty who's ever lived, but he believed just as passionately in social justice. He wrote on liberty, and he and his great love, Harriet Taylor, wrote on the subjection of women, calling out the first great manifesto for absolute equality between the sexes. That was that had to be done through political means. That wasn't an individualist enterprise. That was collective enterprise. So I always think that it's a completely false notion that those two things need be in tension or need be in opposition. Liberalism is both the affirmation of individual liberty, but you can only have individual liberty when you have institutions that allow people to become fully fulfilled and to express themselves.
Yeah. Well, sometimes you hear now in the debates the difference between equality of opportunity versus equality of outcomes. So you have people like Ibram X. Kendi and others in that movement saying until there's an absolute parity, say 13% African Americans in Congress, CEOs of Fortune 500 companies, and so on, then we still live in a racist society. How do you think about those two different things?
Look, I think that affirmative action historically was on the whole, a positive thing. It's a way of getting people, again, who didn't have sufficient access to the kinds of, lack of a better word, elite institutions that empower people in our society into them. And it gave us Bill Clinton and Barack Obama and all kinds of, poor kid from Arkansas, a black kid from Hawaii, had entered into another world. That's a great thing. That's a positive thing. We could multiply that endlessly. So I'm totally in favor of those programs. Absolute equality of outcome is clearly impossible. And the only way you could achieve absolute equality of outcome is by jiggling the dials past a point that they will stand. So and anyway, we don't really want absolute equality of outcome. I don't think anybody on that side really thinks that we should have absolute percentage point by percentage point representation of each group in every graduating class or in every group. Some groups are always going to be overrepresented. And that's, and that's not criminal. We accept that. It's part of what a culture is. So I don't get bent out of shape by the thought of it, because I recognize that most of the work that was being done was remedial work of that kind. If I have a core belief as a liberal, though, and here I think of my one of my heroes, the great Bayard Rustin, who I wrote at length about in the New Yorker not long ago. Liberalism is the art of coalitions. It's not about affirming group identity. It's about releasing ourselves from group identity so that we can join hands in a common cause with people who are not of our class or kind or color or caste, in order to accomplish exactly those social goals of building sewers and building universities and building public schools that we can only do together. None of us there. We're all minorities in that way. So, given the choice between the affirmation of identity and the construction of coalitions, I'm in favor of the second.
And then what do you make of cancel culture and microaggressions and safe spaces and, protecting kids from bad ideas or, canceling or disinviting conservative speakers?
Look, I'm against, I genuinely am a Mill-like liberal. I believe in that there's no idea that it can't stand scrutiny, and frankly, no idea is so horrible that it can't be heard, if only to be argued down. So I believe in all of that, and I think that the whole business of trying to stop people from arguing or appearing is appalling, and I'm opposed to it. I also think that many of the people who try and make that case make it very insincerely. That is to say, they're not genuinely interested in ongoing arguments with people who don't agree with them. They just think that they should have a right to assert their egos in places that don't welcome them. One of the truths about being, if you believe in freedom of speech, is that a lot of the speech will be hostile to you. The moment it crosses the line into personal violence, it's unacceptable. But people will disagree with you. It's one of the fundamental things intellectuals of all kinds have to learn, is that nobody is going to, you will never get universal applause for a point of view. And as I say, I am an absolutist when it comes to kind of million questions of free speech. I'm not actually an absolutist. I'm enough of a Canadian to recognize that there are forms of speech. There is such a thing as hate speech, and we should not encourage it, and we can even ban it. But hate speech is not people asserting, well, they're biological sexes rather than just socially constructed sexes. That's an argument that can be had. Hate speech is Holocaust denial or radical misogyny or those things. And they exist, and I don't mind seeing them suppressed.
One of my favorite quotes from John Stuart Mill is his one about for I guess a liberal society, we need a party of order and stability and a party of change and revolution. What do you think has happened on the other side, to the conservative side of things? The GOP, the Republicans, what has happened to them over the last 10, 15 years?
I obviously, I think it's catastrophic, and I've written about it at length. And the point I always try and make, and I'm out on a kind of speaking tour at liberal arts colleges right now, trying to make this point to 20-somethings, is that it isn't a question of politics as we normally understand them. It's a question that transcends politics, right? We can have rich arguments about a countless number of social controversies. I feel passionately about gun sanity, for instance. It's a subject I've written about at endless length. Every time there's one more gun massacre, the magazine, The New Yorker, asks me to write one more piece, and I go once again with the same passion, the same rationality, and the same horror at what we allow happen in the United States. But I recognize that there are people, Liz Cheney for one, who have passionately different views on it, who see guns as somehow powerful symbols of autonomy and won't surrender them. That's a political argument that we can go on having, and for me, it's passionate. It's not an engineering argument. It's an argument about values, but that's a political argument. An argument that ends politics is not a political argument, and Trumpism and Trump are against liberal institutions in that way and want to shut them down. The moment you refuse to accept the oscillation of power, that's the most basic principle of a liberal democracy. We have our time in power, then you have your time in power. We hate when you're there, you hate when we're there, but we accept that that's the alternative is perpetual civil war. Once that's eradicated, once that's obliterated, it's not possible to talk about politics in that way anymore. We've moved outside politics. So I don't, and I think it's very important that we clarify that difference, right? There are a million things we can argue about: high taxes, low taxes. We can't argue about the ongoing good health of our, not just of our democracy, but of the liberal institutions that support our democracy and those open institutions. And when you see the Republican Party, with whom I might well agree on many specific issues, including some of the ones you've raised, mutiny against the basic practice of liberal democracy, refuse to accept the verdict of an election, turn to violence to reject the verdict of an election, and then pretend that the violence didn't happen. That's outside the realm of politics. That's something that we cannot accept. And the only thing I'd add to that, Michael, because I think it's so important, and it's something I would think that the Skeptic movement and magazine would emphasize beyond all else, is our ability, our right, if you like, our practice of questioning authority is unique. And people, including 20-somethings, treat it as though it were commonplace. In other words, our ability to have this conversation without fear, our ability to write against the government from the right or the left without worrying that we're going to end up in prison, that is historically unique. It is only a practice of a handful of liberal democracies within a tiny historical time frame. And it's unbelievably fragile. And it could disappear at any time. And there are people who are trying to make it disappear, who want it gone because they don't value pluralism as a value at all. They don't think of pluralism as a value. And I think for folks like us, pluralism is a primary value, maybe the primary value. There are very, very few pluralist societies, principled pluralist societies in human history. We live in one with all of its flaws and problems, and we have to protect it with every breath of our bodies.
Yeah, I agree. I was just thinking of Jonathan Rauch's last book, The Constitution of Knowledge, about the norms and standards of objectivity, truth-telling as a underlying value for all political issues. I think that's what we saw with the Liz Cheney phenomenon. Yeah. I don't agree with much of her politics at all, but she's like my new hero because she said, you know, what's even more important than my political positions is truth and reality.
Yeah, and accepting the basic underlying rules of the game, which say, you know, you don't get to bring a machine gun to a Monopoly game. That's not one of the ways you get Park Place. And yes, I admire her too, and I admire all of the principled conservatives, David Frum and Bill Kristol, who had the integrity to say, I cannot play games with this. I will add, as some of your viewers may have seen, that I did a long piece in the New Yorker just a week ago about Hitler's ascent to power, the subject, the third rail of history you're not supposed to touch. And in it, I never mentioned Trump by name or contemporary politics specifically, but I did hope that people would discern significant patterns of how it is that demagogues take over in a democracy. And it's always because the decent people say, well, we can control him and we can, he's bad, but mean tweets, right? Or whatever the equivalent is at a given historical moment. But the other side is so much worse. The other side is going to destroy us, right? They're socialists, they're communists. So we have to stick with him because we have no choice. They've given us no choice. That's, you know, a very familiar argument from anti-Trumpites. Oh, the liberals give us no choice except to support Trump. You always have a choice, and I respect people who have made the honorable choice.
Yeah. I do God debates at Christian churches and universities and whatnot. So many years I've been asking, why Trump? You're conservative, you're Christian, you're the party of values and family values and morality and right and wrong. And their answer seems to be, before the Roe decision, it was he's going to get us the judges to overturn Roe. Well, he did. And another one was, well, God works in mysterious ways. Look at some of the flawed characters he picked in the Bible to deliver his message, and Trump is like that. And then the last one was, it's a team sport. I can never vote Democrat, period.
It's pure tribalism. Then it becomes pure tribalism, right? And but this is not the first time it's ever happened. Whenever an authoritarian comes to power, it's because, and that's true on the left and right. You could write the same story about authoritarians coming to power in Eastern Europe after 1945. And the decent people said, well, on the other hand, the other side, they've still got fascists. The fascists are still around. So we have to side with the Stalinists against the fascists, or we have to side with the fascists against the Stalinists. You never have to make that choice. And the people we revere from the 20th century, George Orwell or Albert Camus, were the people who said, nope, I don't have to make that choice. I have to be equally against the authoritarian appetites of the right and against the totalitarian temptations of the left. And my integrity depends on my rejecting both with equal fervor.
All right, Adam, we're at an hour and a half. Last question on current events. Is it a liberal thing to support Ukraine and Israel? And what do you think about those unfolding events?
I don't want to duck the question, Michael, but I also am not an all-purpose pundit, and I've never set myself up as one. And I have never been to Ukraine, and I have never been to Israel. And I would be hard-pressed to pretend that I have sufficient omniscience to offer educated opinions. I would hate to hear somebody opining about the United States or Canada or France, 3 places I have lived in, who had never been there.
Okay, then more generally. So you'll hear somebody like RFKJ say,
right,
it's not any of our business. Why do we have to be the world's policemen and all that stuff? Isn't it a liberal cause to help people who can't help themselves?
Right. Yeah, I was about to say, without pretending to speak to the specifics of those cases, because as I am not an all-purpose pundit, I am a miscellaneous comic essayist. But I think that one of the things that history shows us is that embattled small democracies deserve the help and support of embattled large democracies, and that when we fail to come to their aid and support, we always regret it afterwards, without exception. That doesn't mean that there's not a reasonable case to be made that Ukraine has an old relationship with Russia, and we can tolerate something other than Ukrainian membership in NATO. And it doesn't mean that everything that Israel does is well advised or in its own long-term interests. Clearly, I think it is not. But it does mean that the concert of democratic nations should stand alongside each other. That's been a good historic rule.
All right, Adam Gopnik, thanks for your book. Here it is. All that happiness is. Get it and read it. Big admirer of your work, Adam. What's your next book you're gonna work on?
I think I may, depending on how life goes and whether we end in exile or not, I may go back to. I'm working on 2 musical theater pieces, which I'm very proud of. And nice. Then my next book, I think I'm going to go back to France, and I'm going to try and assemble all of the writing I've done about France in the past 25 years since my book Paris to the Moon came out.
Oh, wow.
And go back to Paris and back to the moon.
All right.